Hi there, welcome to A Mystery and a Mess. I'm Amanda, and this is my mess. Every week I pick one mess in my space to clean up, and while I clean, I recount a fascinating true story to entertain myself and hopefully you. Sometimes the story is true crime, sometimes it's weird history, could be wild science. This week, the story I will be telling is of Dennis Nilsen, a British serial killer, also known as the Kindly Killer or the Muswell Hill Murderer. So fire up those mirror neurons and let's get cleaning. All right, so the content warning for today's story, Dennis Nilsen, the Kindly Killer or the Muswell Hill Killer. Lots of content warnings. This is a serial killer case. So content warnings include necrophilia, murder of men and teenage boys, homophobia, sexual assault, childhood trauma, and me dealing with a tragic story by making mediocre jokes. Picture it. London, 1983. The residents of the apartments in 23 Cranley Gardens have been experiencing repeated clogged drains, and plumber Michael Catran has been called out to locate the source of the problems. Under a drain cover on the side of the house, he finds that the plumbing is clogged with chunks of meat and small bones. He thinks this is suspicious, and Catran calls his supervisor to report it to him. Since it is the end of the day, they agree that they'll come back the next day to further investigate the blockage. And before he left, Catran spoke to two tenants of 23 Cranley Gardens, Dennis Nilsen, or Des Nilsen as he was known, and Jim Alcock. Catran commented to these gentlemen that the substance looked like it could be human flesh, and Nielsen replied something along the lines of, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken." Anyway, the next morning at 7:30 a.m., Catran and his supervisor, Mr. Wheeler, they returned to 23 Cranley Gardens, and they find, when they go to investigate what's causing the drain blockage, they find that the drain is no longer blocked. It's been cleared out, which they find even more suspicious. So Catran digs further into the pipes, and up in one of the pipes he finds some scraps of flesh and 4 small bones, which to him and to Mr. Wheeler look like human hand bones. So they immediately call the police, who upon closer inspection discovered more small bones and scraps of what looked like either human flesh or animal meat in the same pipe. This is the pipe that leads from the very top apartment at this Cranley flat. So police come, and the police take the meat and bones, and they take them to the mortuary at Hornsey, where the pathologist, Professor David Bowen, determined that the remains were human remains, and that one particular piece of flesh was actually from a neck, and it had ligature marks on it, indicating that there had been strangulation involved in the death of the person whose flesh this was. And that brings me to why I chose this story. So I was looking up stupid ways that killers have been caught. And this one stood out to me. This guy got caught because he was flushing chunks of people down the toilet. And even my 5-year-old can tell you that you do not flush any non-potty appropriate materials down the toilet because it will clog. So just, come on, dude. The guy who was flushing the people parts down the toilet was Dennis Nilsen. And when I first looked up a picture of him, I got a bit of a shock. So I looked up a picture of this guy, I Googled him, and you get that spread of images. And the first image that my eye fell on, I thought, damn, this guy looks exactly like David Tennant. And it turns out it actually was a picture of David Tennant. Take a look. Hello, Doctor, or Crowley, or Trefu Tom if you have kids. Turns out that David Tennant is using his Kilgrave evil skills to play this sicko in a 3-part series based on a book called Killing for Company. This is what Dennis Nilsen actually looked like. So Dennis Nilsen has a sad backstory that really upsets me. And it kind of provides some insight into his actions. But he was also a narcissistic psycho, and he murdered around 15 people. So I'm going to try to keep his backstory relatively short. If you're interested in more of it, you should give a watch to a YouTube video by Eleanor Neal that she did a while back on this guy. She does a really great job of sort of going into his backstory, and I'll link her video in the description below, where I always link all of my references. And she tells sort of a more sympathetic side of this story. In doing my research for this, I sort of realized that there's basically like 2 camps or categories of articles about this guy. I suspect it's probably true for most like serial killer type situations. There are the people and the articles that are very sympathetic, that focus on the backstory and this guy's childhood trauma. These are, I think, in the vein of the individuals who have dubbed this guy the kindly killer. And then there are the other extreme of, just straight up he's a psychopath and he's evil, and totally erasing his backstory. Now, I do think that he's a psychopath and he's awful, and when you look at like I saw just a couple videos of him talking and stuff, his arrogance and narcissism really comes through, which I didn't initially pick up on because it was just reading about him, and in the text he comes off as more sympathetic because of his backstory. But basically, when Dennis Nilsen was a small child, he didn't really have much of a father figure. His dad wasn't around much, and he didn't have much of a father figure. His dad wasn't around much, but he was super close to his grandfather. Like, he loved his grandfather. They spent tons of time together. He was obsessed with his granddad. His granddad was really sweet and kind to him. And when his grandfather, who was a fisherman, he was away on a fishing trip when Nilsen was 6. Some sources say 5. But the last documentary I watched that actually had the police involved in the case in it, again, linked in the description, that said 6. So I think that's more likely. When he was 6, his grandfather had been away on a fishing trip, and Nilsen came home from school, and his mom said, "Hey, do you want to see your grandfather?" And he didn't even know his grandfather's back, and he was so excited. And as it turns out, his grandfather had died. And so Nilsen rushes into the other room thinking he's going to see his grandfather, and instead he finds a dead body in an open coffin. His grandfather was white as a sheet and dead in this open coffin, so rather than, sitting him down compassionately and explaining things, his brilliant mom thought this was the greatest. It was a good way to let him know his grandfather had died. So Nilsen claims that this trauma, the trauma of this experience, triggered his obsession with death. And there's some experts and psychologists that say that they think that at this point it caused him to link love and death inextricably in his brain. And his mom says that after that experience, he was never quite the same. Well, duh, lady. What the fuck did you expect was going to happen? Oh my gosh. Now, this is one example of many traumas that he suffered as a child. And does that make any of his crimes okay? No, it freaking doesn't. Maybe a little less trauma in his childhood, though, might have, changed the course of his life a bit. So, Dennis also, as he grew, struggled with his sexuality. He found himself skewing towards homosexuality, being attracted to men, and skewing towards necrophilia. And this is an important point to stop and get something straight. No pun intended. Being gay or queer or non-heterosexual had nothing to do with the crimes that Dennis Nilsen committed. Being non-heterosexual in any way never has anything to do with causing someone to commit crimes. Sexual orientation and criminal tendencies are not related at all. If you think even a little bit that they are, you really need to educate yourself, because you're just wrong. That's not how it works. And to be further clear, sexual orientation refers only to attraction to consenting adult partners. Necrophilia is not a sexual orientation, the same way that pedophilia is not a sexual orientation. So Dennis Nilsen was attracted to men, and this was a huge problem for him throughout his teenage and young adult years, because the hate against queer folk in the 60s and 70s was rife. So it said he left home at 15. He joined the army when he was young. I don't think they'd let him join the army at 15. I don't know what age he was, but he joined the army. And during the years that he was in the army, his childhood obsession with death started to sort of crystallize. He took up photography as sort of a hobby. And he would get his army buddies to lay around as though they were dead, posing like dead bodies, like they had been shot or killed in combat, and he would photograph them that way. And then he would display the photos and spend a lot of time with these photos. He also, I think it was a little later than this, would put death mask makeup on himself, red in his eyes, wash out his face, blue lips, and lay in front of a mirror and pretend to be dead himself. Dennis Nilsen's army buddies were not particularly nice to him. They didn't seem to like him very much. They often called him homophobic slurs, but they were really the only friends that he had at that time. So even in spite of all of that, he would go out with them, go out drinking with them. And after one incident where he blacked out drinking with his army buddies, and another incident where he was sexually assaulted, Dennis Nilsen started doing this thing where he would go out drinking with his army buddies and pretend to drink a lot more than he actually had. And then he would act like, the heck? He would act like he was too drunk to make it back to his place on his own, and he would go home with his army buddies and then pretend to pass out, apparently in hopes that one of them would try to have sex with him. And yet another important point is brought to us. This guy, Dennis Nilsen, is legitimately crazy. He's seriously mentally ill. And so it is important to point out that no one is ever asking to be raped. No one wants that. And there are healthy and safe ways to practice fantasies of control and submission through educated and consensual BDSM. And I can provide resources on that if anyone is interested. Let me know. I'll put them in the bibliography or the comments. But anyway, so that was sort of how his life in the Army went. He was in the Army, I think, for 11 years. And after getting out of the Army, he went on to become a police officer, which is sort of a trend you kind of see with these guys. However, Dennis Nilsen did not actually stay a police officer for all that long. It's implied that it was just really hard at that time to divide one's life between being gay and being a cop. And it was dangerous for a cop if that were to have come out about him. So Dennis switched to a different branch of civil service and started working at a jobs center. By now, it's the late 70s, and Dennis feels like the only person that he has ever truly loved, that has ever truly loved him, is his grandfather. And he's longing for companionship, for a relationship. He frequents pubs and gay bars, trying to meet men, but he's frustrated by the fact that the gay scene in London in the 70s, in the late 70s, seems to him to be dominated by one-night stands, and most men that he meets seem like they are afraid to get into a long-term or committed relationship. They don't really want to be out. But Dennis actually does find a relationship. One day he sees two big burly guys harassing a small guy outside a gay club. And he steps in to defend this smaller guy from the bigger guys, and then he ends up inviting that smaller gentleman back to his house, back to his flat for drinks. And he finds out that that man is transient. He doesn't have any place to stay. So Dennis invited him to stay and live with him. He then used some of his savings to rent them a garden apartment, and they lived there like a couple. You know, you reach that point where it's all pots and pans. If I could just get 2 loads of dishes done in one day, I'd be able to catch everything up. Or if I did, 700 hand wash, I swear every pot and pan that we own is dirty right now. So Dennis used some of his savings to rent them a garden apartment, and they lived there like a couple. Dennis worked while his boyfriend stayed home and renovated the apartment. It was in pretty poor condition. It needed a lot of fixing up. They got a dog who they named Bleep. She's a border collie. Over the years, Dennis Nilsen has apparently made conflicting statements about whether he and this other man were a couple and whether or not they engaged in sexual intercourse. And you'll notice throughout the story there are a few odd instances of Dennis Nilsen sort of suddenly going, "Oh, no homo, dude, no homo." And I'm sure that a lot of that has to do with, the traumas in his life. But it's also clear, when you hear him talk, or hear the psychologists talk about him, that he's really arrogant and narcissistic, and that this focus on whether or not he's having sex with these men is like a narcissistic manipulation of his own image, both his self-image and what he wants other people to perceive him as and know of him. But after about 18 months to a year to 18 months, the relationship deteriorated, and that other gentleman, his boyfriend, moved out of the house. And Dennis was really upset and deeply hurt by the end of this relationship. This may have felt like the first time he had connected with another person since he was 6 years old. So he was mourning that loss on December 29th of on December 29th of 1978, Dennis met a young man and invited him for a drink. They were drinking together at a pub, and then they went back to Dennis's apartment to drink more. They drank until they both fell asleep. Dennis says that they fell asleep in different beds, and then that does not fit. They drank until they both fell asleep in different beds, and in the morning, Dennis woke up before this boy, and he was watching the boy sleep, and he caressed him in his sleep, and he found himself very afraid that he would wake him up. He didn't want to wake the boy up because he didn't want him to leave. And just suddenly, Dennis decided that this boy, in Dennis's own words, was going to stay with him over the new year, whether he wanted to or not. So without much real conscious thought, at least according to Dennis, he went in the other room and got a necktie and came back and strangled this boy. He then used a bucket of water to drown the unconscious youth and make sure that he was dead. After killing him, Nilsen lay next to the body for a long time, and he says he experienced a sense of tranquility like never before. For the next week, he lived with the body. He bathed it, he propped it up in an armchair and talked to it when he would come home from work, and he also engaged in masturbatory necrophilia with the body, and so on. This was Nilsen's first victim, and this victim remained unidentified until 2006, which is nearly 30 years after he was murdered and over 20 years after Nilsen was caught. The thing is, when Dennis Nilsen was caught, he made a confession, but he couldn't remember this boy's name. All he could remember was basically the details of the encounter and that the kid seemed to be 17 or 18 years old. The victim actually turned out to be 14 years old. His name was Stephen Dean Holmes. Police linked Stephen Dean Holmes to Nilsen's crimes and Nilsen's admissions in 2005 when they were going through old missing person files as part of a review. At that time, photographs of the missing boy were shown to Nilsen in prison, and he confirmed that that was indeed his first victim. Stephen Holmes's father and sister were able to get some closure and find out what happened to him, but very tragically, his mother, who had never stopped searching for him, passed away before this connection was made. On October 11th, 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho. He had met Ho at a pub and lured him back to his flat with a promise of sex. And Nilsen then attempted to strangle Andrew Ho, but he managed to get away and flee, and Andrew Ho reported the incident to police. And they questioned Nilsen in relation to the incident, but ultimately they didn't take it seriously. They basically said that it was, a gay domestic dispute and, possibly some rough sex gone wrong. And they pretty much just dismissed the whole thing. Oh, and since Andrew Ho was drunk at the time, they extra didn't take it seriously because, drinking means you're asking for it. God. So anyway, he could have been stopped then and there, but he wasn't, and he went about his life. His next two victims were a 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Ockenden, which was on the 3rd of December, 1979, and then 16-year-old Martin Duffy on May 17th, 1980. After Duffy's murder, Nilsen began to kill with an increasing frequency. Before the end of 1980, he would kill another 5 men and attempted to kill one other. And of those, only 26-year-old William David Sutherland has ever been identified. Dennis Nilsen developed a pattern, a habit during the course of his murder spree. He would meet men typically at pubs or gay bars or just on the street. Some of his victims were homeless, and he would invite them back to his apartment where he would give them food or drinks and sometimes sex, and then he would strangle them, usually with a ligature, usually a necktie. And once they were unconscious, he would, he would strangle them if they became unconscious, but he didn't succeed in killing them through strangulation. He would then drown them in his bathtub or sink or a bucket of water. After that, he would observe this ritual in which he would bathe the bodies and sort of strip them of their identifying characteristics, their clothes and their possessions. He was not the type of serial killer to keep trophies or valuables from his victims. He would dispose of all of that. And so he would bathe them, strip them. This has mushroom spores in it. I need to take it out to the garden and spread it. It's a weird jumping topic. So this habit he got into with his victims, where he would bathe them, and then he would keep them as company. He would sit with them and watch TV. He would sort of drape their arms over him, or he would lay with them. Look at this. In the last video, I cleaned this shelf, and look, it's already getting messy again. Oh, goodness. He would lay with his victims' bodies. He would chat with them, and he would masturbate with or on the bodies. During later years and in confessions and interviews, Dennis Nilsen was always very emphatic that while he was aroused by these dead bodies, he never had penetrative sex with them. He, engaged in a lot of masturbatory acts with the bodies that were necrophilia. And again, it comes to this weird, like, oh yeah, I'm good with, murdering and dismembering, but no homo, dude, no homo. Like, what the heck? And again, I get that he had a lot of trauma surrounding his, leaves on my fingers, a lot of trauma surrounding his sexuality, but he was totally okay with admitting to having sex with men and murdering men. And I'm also not saying he's lying. It's just what he did was he tried to explain this focus on not penetrating them by saying that his relationship with these dead bodies after he murdered these men, he tried to make it sound magical or ethereal and sacred. And to him, penetrative sex with them was just too banal and not ritualistic enough. Like, so yeah, okay, you'll murder people and jack off on corpses. Not really buying this, like, magical ritual, dude. Then, after a week or so of living with the dead bodies, when decomposition started to set in, he would stash the bodies. When decomposition started to set in, he would hide the bodies beneath the floorboards of his apartment. And he would also occasionally, pull the bodies up out of the floorboards, even though he admitted that they were pretty gross by then. As his killing spree continued, the bodies under his floor started to take up more and more space, and he started to dismember the bodies to try to fit them better. All right, so I was hoping to get all of this done while the kids weren't home because, these are not child-friendly stories. But I also, it's life. So you can probably see in the background there's a cartoon going. They're in the other room. There's also a fan blowing on them, so they cannot hear me. But I'm going to have to be extra careful in telling the story and making sure I'm paying attention and that they're not sneaking up behind me to eavesdrop. The little monsters. So In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord told him he was going to have to move out. See, look at this. What's up, you? Well, those are not clean anymore. In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord told him that he needed to move out because the landlord was planning to renovate the building. Nilsen really didn't want to move out, but the landlord was going to, evict him either way. And ultimately, his landlord paid him £1,000 to move out, and Nilsen accepted that he was going to have to move out of his flat. Dennis knew that, of course, now he was going to have to do something about the bodies under the floorboards. So he spent an entire week's worth of evenings pulling out the bodies and dismembering them. He said that in order to do this, he would have to get himself really drunk, and that he threw up multiple times trying to get through this process. Don't kill people and you won't run into this issue. After he cut apart the bodies, he would wrap them in carpet and plastic to make them look like they were renovation waste, so that when he was moving them about, people wouldn't really notice anything suspicious. And then he burned all the bodies in bonfires in his backyard. And he would pile them up and have a fire, and he would put a tire on top so that the smell of burning tire would cover up the smell of burning flesh. He would have these fires in the super early morning hours when it was still dark, so that the fire would burn and burn out, burn everything down to ashes, and burn out by the time his neighbors woke up. That was the goal, although at one point he said there were neighbor kids watching him have this fire, which is gross and creepy. Then afterward, he would rake through the ashes to make sure there were no large chunks of bone remaining. And at one point in time, he actually had to smash a skull with his rake that hadn't burned down in the fire. In all, he had 4 different fires, and one source made it seem like they were all in the days leading up to when he had to move, and other sources made it seem like they were more spread apart during, as the bodies were building up under the floorboards. So he moved. He moved into an attic apartment at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, which is, of course, where his moniker, the Muswell Hill Murderer, Muswell Hill Killer, came from. Ugh. Now, this is an attic apartment, so there's no floorboards, no space under the floorboards that he can get to stash bodies. There's no backyard to burn bodies in. There's no effective place for him to dispose of bodies, but he wasn't worried about that, apparently, because he planned to stop killing. He believed he was going to stop killing at this point in time. The thing about this plan to not kill anymore, though, was that he also claimed that that he wasn't really in control of most of these murders, that he was blacked out when they happened. Aside from the first couple, he said he would, basically black out. He would wake up in the morning and there would be a dead body. And there would be a dead body, and he would know that he had killed again. And I know how he feels. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and realize, oh no, the cat got sick. And so it's sort of like waking up and realizing, oh no, there's another corpse. On November 23, 1981, he attempted to strangle a 19-year-old named Paul Nobbs, but Dennis stopped himself from completing the act, and Dennis Nilsen then held out until March of 1982, which is when he encountered a 23-year-old named John Howlett, who he followed his normal pattern with, brought him back to his apartment and strangled him. John Howlett fought back very viciously, and actually left strangulation marks on Dennis Nilsen's neck for about a week. But ultimately Dennis Nilsen did kill John Howlett, and then he had another body to get rid of and no way to dispose of it. Now, the mess is, for the most part, cleaned up, and it's important to note that now, because I have to start cooking dinner because it is getting late, and this giant pile of pots and pans off to the side that you can't see, they're gonna have to wait. So Dennis Nilsen has this body that that he needs to get rid of, and he doesn't know what to do with it. The new strategy that Dennis Nilsen developed to get rid of bodies was he would first dismember the body when he was done with it. He would dismember it, he would strip as much of the flesh and muscle tissue off the body as he could, cutting it into chunks and flushing it down the toilet, which we've talked about. It's stupid. He would boil the heads, hands, and feet in order to separate the small bones from the tissues. And let's see, he would throw the internal organs apparently over the back fence in his backyard, like for wildlife to consume. And sometimes he would throw out the bones, with his regular trash. And then large body sections that he hadn't yet figured out what to do with, mainly torsos, he would just wrap in a bin bag and basically hide them away in a closet in his apartment. So not a great plan. His apartment did not smell okay. There are a few reasons that Nilsen was dubbed the kindly killer. He encountered a 23-year-old at one point named Malcolm Barlow. And this guy was on the sidewalk outside Nilsen's house. And Nilsen brought him inside, and Malcolm Barlow told him that he was very sick. He had run out of his epilepsy medication. He wasn't feeling well. Nilsen made sure he got to the hospital and got medical attention. Then later, when Barlow returned to Nilsen's home, apparently to say thank you, Nilsen then murdered him and did his regular ritual. So I don't know how kindly that really is. Nilsen also claims to have tried to resuscitate several of his victims, and says that at times he would, cry and sob over the bodies of his victims. But maybe just don't kill people. I don't think that crying really makes up for it. In May of 1982, Nilsen met a gay man who worked as a drag queen named Carl Stoddard. He was 21 at the time, and Nilsen invited Stoddard back to his flat and assured him that he had no sexual intentions toward him, because Stoddard was mourning the breakup of a relationship, and he was feeling very depressed and vulnerable. So they went back and they drank, and at the end of the night, Nilsen gave Stoddard a sleeping bag to sleep in, and mentioned, be careful not to get stuck in the zip. In the middle of the night, Stoddard woke up and Nilsen was strangling him, but Stoddard was really confused because he thought what had happened was that he had gotten caught in the zipper and that Nilsen was trying to free him, but Stoddard quickly lost consciousness, and then he remembered, the next thing he remembers is hearing water running, and he suddenly realized that he was under the water and that Nilsen was like holding him down under the water. And Stoddard struggled and tried to get up, and when he was able to get his head above water and take a gasping breath of air, he begged, like, please, no more, but Nilsen shoved him back down under the water. So Nilsen thought that he had killed Stoddard, and he went through his regular ritual of washing the body, and he propped Stoddard up in an armchair. And it was then that Nilsen noticed that his dog Bleep, the border collie that he had gotten a while back, climbed up on Stoddard's lap and was licking his face, which indicated to Nilsen that Stoddard was still alive, and also makes me like super curious about the life of this dog. I mean, there's a lot of decomposition and chopping up of bodies and stuff, and apparently the dog was never an issue. So when Bleep the dog started licking Carl Stoddard's face and Nilsen realized that he was still alive, he got sort of weirdly happy about it and started rubbing Stoddard's limbs and massaging him, trying to get circulation increased and get blood flow to his heart, and he wrapped him up in blankets and laid him in his bed and basically started trying to take care of him and trying to resuscitate him. And when Stoddard finally regained consciousness, Nilsen was really excited and embraced him and told Stoddard that what had happened was that he had gotten stuck in the zipper, like Nilsen had warned, and Nilsen said that he had saved Stoddard from strangling in the zipper while Stoddard was having a nightmare. Over the next couple of days, Stoddard sort of drifted in and out of consciousness, and eventually when he was healthy enough, or awake enough, he asked Nilsen about the water and why he was strangling him and why he was drowning him. And Nilsen told him, know that you had been strangled by the zipper, and when I was finally able to get you free, you were in shock, so I had to put you in the cold water because you were in shock. After a couple days of recovery, Nilsen took Stoddard to a train station and told him basically that he hoped they would meet again. Stoddard went straight to the hospital from the train station, where he was treated for burst blood vessels in his face, water in his lungs, cuts and abrasions to his neck. And 2 weeks later, Carl Stoddard went to the police, but, and I know this is going to shock you, the police didn't take him seriously. Carl Stoddard is quoted as having said, in those less enlightened times, the gay aspect meant complaints were swept under the carpet. It's very sad. Carl Stoddard basically then had no other option but to block out the memory of what had happened to him. But eventually he was reading a horror novel, and there was a scene in the novel that triggered some memories, and he started to have flashbacks and terrifying memories of the attack. But sadly, no one really believed him, and his family suggested that he go and see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And every medical professional that he went to see, they all told him that he was having false memories. Let me tell you, I've had my fill of medical professionals discounting people's lived experiences, especially when they disrespect that person because of their race or gender or sexual orientation. But anyway, Carl Stoddard was told that these were false memories by several different sources, and he spent years of therapy trying to overcome his false memories. It's very, very sad. It wasn't until Dennis Nilsen's confession that any of this was tied to an old police report of Stoddard's. After Stoddard, Dennis went on to kill... Hold on. I'm trying to do this without hurting myself, because these things are like flying off the mandolin here. Alright, those are all cut. After Stoddard, Dennis Nilsen went on to kill Graham Allen, a 27-year-old man, in September of 1982, and in January of 1983, a 20-year-old named Stevenson. More dishes! On February 9th, 1983, On February 9th, 1983, after finding out that the tissue and bones in the plumbing at 23 Cranley Gardens were human remains, after determining that they were human remains and determining that the remains were in a pipe that led from the uppermost attic apartment where Dennis Nilsen lived, 3 police officers waited for him to return from work and then knocked on his door. When they entered the apartment, they immediately noticed the very strong smell of decomposing bodies or rotting flesh. And when Nilsen asked the police why they were interested in clogged drains, they told him that the drain blockage had been caused by human flesh. And Nilsen, tried to react shocked. He said, "Oh my God, that's awful." But the main police detective, or the head detective that was there, basically said to him, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" And at that point, Dennis Nilsen did not try to hide any longer. He was really calm and admitted that the rest of the body was in 2 plastic garbage bags in a nearby wardrobe or closet for those of us Canadian Americans. The police officers did not open the cupboard immediately, but they asked Nilsen if there were any other body parts, and Nilsen said, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything, but I want to get it off my chest, but not here at the police station." So they arrested him. They read him his rights, or they cautioned him, arrested him on suspicion of murder, and then took him to the Hornsey police station. On the way to the police station, one of the cops asked him if it was, if the human remains in his flat belonged to one body or two, and Nilsen responded that it was more like 15 or 16, which shocked the heck out of the police officers. There's actually a sort of humorous clip of one of the police officers recounting that moment in one of the documentaries listed as my sources. So the police wanted to keep the story quiet during the investigation, but Michael Catran, the plumber, sold the story to the media for 300 pounds pretty much immediately. And he wasn't the only one to cash in. Dennis was arrested on February 9th, and by February 11th, his blue ribbon mother had provided photos of him throughout his life to the press. On February 11th, 1983, Nilsen was officially charged with the murder of Stevenson, his last victim, and started to await trial. Before his trial, he did this ridiculous back and forth thing that is not all that uncommon, especially in really narcissistic individuals. He went back and forth, firing his attorney and saying he was going to represent himself, and the attorney was reassigned to him, and back and forth. Eventually, he was assigned yet another attorney, and he ended up going to trial with that defense attorney. His trial started on the 24th of October in 1983, and he was charged. By that point in time, they had added more charges. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He had also led the police, or told the police, about the bodies that he had burned at his first house. So they had gone back there and collected up, or done an investigation, collected up those remains, done an entomological examination of the space under the floorboards, and found evidence that there had been decaying bodies kept there. Dog is out on the deck barking. Initially, he had planned to plead guilty, but on advice of counsel, he decided to plead not guilty by reason of diminished capacity, which that's good legal advice. Oh my gosh, I finished the video and then took it down and it had shut off automatically. How frustrating. So I'm as you can see, I'm done cleaning. I'm halfway into cooking dinner, but let me wrap up the story and the trial for you real quick. So, like I said, the main dispute between the prosecution and the defense was not whether or not Nilsen had actually committed these murders and attempted murders. It was his state of mind before, during, and after the murders. So the prosecution argued that Nilsen was sane, was in full control of what he was doing, and that he premeditated these murders. And the defense counsel argued that Nilsen was incapable of forming any actual intention to commit murder, and he should therefore be convicted of manslaughter rather than homicide. This is really similar to the back and forth and the sanity discussion that took place 2 different times in the Marcia Held case, which was a bonkers case with a belief in the second coming of Christ and snake beheading and just craziness in the prettiest house. Check that video out earlier in my feed if you're interested. But anyway, that was the main topic that they were going back and forth about. at Dennis Nilsen's trial. And on November 3rd of 1983, the jury began their deliberation. And the next day, they returned a majority verdict of guilty on 6 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder, and then a unanimous verdict of guilty on the attempted murder of Paul Nobbs. The judge in the case, Judge Kroom Johnson, sentenced Nilsen to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. So basically, he got like 25 to life. And in 1994, the minimum of 25 years to life was replaced with a whole life tariff by Home Secretary Michael Howard. And Nilsen, it said that he accepted this punishment, he accepted this change. And for the non-Brits, a whole life tariff, which is now called a whole life order, is basically an order where a prisoner who's being sentenced to a term of life imprisonment is must serve that term with no possibility of parole or conditional release. It's usually made when there's aggravating circumstances. The person has to have been over 21 when they committed the crime, and it just guarantees that certain types of killers or certain types of criminals will stay in prison for their entire lives with no possibility of release, with a very small exception for possible compassionate grounds. So Dennis Nilsen remained in prison after that until he died of natural causes related to a blood clot surgery on May 12th, 2018. I've also included a funny article. Well, the article itself is not very funny, but the situation is funny. Down in the references in the description box, at one point when he was in prison, he wrote to the press about how terrible the sex offender classes that he had to take were, and why it's funny is because they were terrible. They ended up being discontinued because they were so bad that they were actually making the sex offenders more likely to reoffend. So, lovely. Anyway, thank you for joining me. Anyway, thank you for joining me for this week's A Mystery and a Mess. We've gotten a lot of cleaning done. I've gotten dinner pretty well started. Got a huge amount of pots and pans I still need to get done, but I make no promises that the mess will be totally gone at the end of these videos. Please like and subscribe and let me know what length of videos that you like the most. Last week's video, if you want to compare, on the Boston Massacre was definitely my shortest video with the smallest mess to go with it. So leave that down in the comments and anything else you'd like to see on the channel. And if you like true crime and weird history and wild science and getting done, then come back next week and join me for another mystery and another mess. And in the meantime, learn something new and clean up your act.